I apologize. Nobody wants to be
I'm
away
holding
from that
myself
way.
back by Perry here.
Let's hope it doesn't happen again. All right. So, I can tell. Does anybody know like this? Stuff like this?
It's all you guys.
It's just, it sounds bad too. I don't know what's going on here, but I'll just shout if I have to. Is everybody good? Can you hear me? All right. So, two things. If you are a visitor, we'd love for you to fill out a connection card, which you should have received on the way in. You just jot down your name and information and drop it in the basket on the way out. It helps us keep in touch with you and let you know that we're so grateful that you decided to come here this morning. And maybe we can share some other ways that you can be involved in our church. Also, Sam will be handing these out, or Bo will be on the after church on your way out. Again, this is just a little plug for this international friendship dinner, Friendsgiving dinner. It's going to take place at the Waldrons, and so if you'd like to become a part of that, just sit down, share a meal with an international student who perhaps has never had a meal in an American home before. We have some students that we've kind of adopted that would love to, are excited to come, and they wanted to meet you as well. So anyway, there's a couple like how you can help. If you can't make it for the meeting after this message, just take one of these with you and email Sam or Bo to kind of figure out next steps there. So anyway, take that with you as well. Here we are, week 11 in a series called Investigating the Gospel, where every week we answer a big question. Now, one of the problems with this series I'm discovering is that sometimes the questions are so big and so enormous that I feel like I can't possibly answer them thoroughly in one sermon, unless I preach for like 2 hours. Anybody want me to preach for 2 hours? Yeah. Look at all the hands go up. James, all right, we'll have James and Robin, we'll have a right. So I completely understand if at the conclusion of today's sermon you are filled with but what ifs. Oh, but Pastor, but what if? And you've got situations in your mind and your thoughts, and so I'm happy to sit down over coffee and answer your what ifs this week, so don't let that distract you. But here's the big question today is, does God still heal today? Does God still heal today? And I just read an article recently by a guy named Klaus Eisler. And he was talking in this article about how we all have certain core beliefs, all right? For instance, here's a core belief that we all have, and it is in the law of gravity, all right? We all believe that if we jump off of a high building, we're going to fall, all right? And even a little child at some point recognizes the danger of this, and they may not be able to articulate an intelligent response as to, the law of gravity, but deep inside them, it's a core belief. I shouldn't do this thing. And no matter what someone tells you, even if they pay you a lot of money to try to rework your understanding of gravity, when it comes to standing on the edge of or jumping out of a window, you're just going to freeze up because you have a deeply held, true core belief that you shouldn't do that. It's going to end badly for you if you did that. All right? Yeah, and so all throughout our lives, and even throughout history, we have true core beliefs and we have false core beliefs deep inside of us, right? I mean, at one point, we all thought the earth was flat. Some people still think the moon landing was for real. I'm just kidding. Anyway, when we talk about beliefs, it sounds like we're talking about things that we think or principles that we agree with. But really what we're talking about are the things that affect our behavior. Like we live out what our beliefs are. So sometimes when I preach, I'm filling our brains up with all sorts of things that hopefully are true from God's Word, all right? But heart change, like the things that make us change our actions, those take longer to process, or we have to be confronted with an astounding, difference to our reality, to what we believe. It's why Jesus in the Bible talks so much about the heart of people and not so much about the mind of people. He talks about, for instance, when he's talking about money and how to handle wealth, he says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is going to be also. One time he's yelling at some religious leaders and he talks about how they're all perfect on the outside, but on the inside, they're just like tombs with dead people inside of them. And so Jesus cared very deeply about this idea of inside of us. Whether we're conscious of them or not, we all have beliefs that affect the way that we live our lives. Here's an example. of Jesus and his own disciples. Jesus dies, and when he comes back to life, he appears, first of all, at the tomb that day to some women. And he tells these ladies, guess what? I'm alive, go tell the disciples. And the women run and tell the disciples, and the disciples, the Bible records, that they said to the ladies, this is nonsense. They thought it was nonsense that Jesus would be alive. Like, they had a deep core belief that it was impossible for Jesus to come back to life. Even though, during Jesus' own life, they had seen him raise other dead people back to life. They've observed that. Even though, like, multiple times before he dies, Jesus sits his disciples down and very clearly says to them, guys, I'm going to die soon. And then 3 days after I die, I'm going to come back to life. Despite the fact that Jesus did these things and said these things to them, when faced with the reality of his resurrection, they just didn't believe it. They said it was easier for them to believe that the women were lying than to believe that Jesus actually came back to life. And when they do meet Jesus, he has to tell them not to be afraid because they're just so confounded by this. You remember the one, Thomas actually has to touch his hands and his side to believe deeply that Jesus had come back to life. And so core beliefs are influential in the way that we see the world and the way that we process our actions. And it's very hard to change these core beliefs. But we're responsible for our hearts. Jesus tells us that we are responsible for our hearts, and therefore we are also responsible to steward and be careful with what we believe to be true and what we believe to be false. And so here's a quote from the same author, Klaus Isler. He says, if truth can make us more free and if core beliefs always direct our lives, both true and false ones, then our lives will experience greater flourishing than we currently do as we embrace a greater set of core true beliefs than we currently hold. And we allow these beliefs to become more deeply internalized. So as Christians, we believe that God's word is truth. And while we often agree to things in the Bible mentally, like we can articulate and explain them very well, oftentimes, unknowingly, we disbelieve it in our heart and in our actions. And I think that this topic of Jesus healing people is one of those things that we often agree to with our minds, but in our hearts and our actions demonstrate something differently. And so today, we're going to look at a story in the book of John that I briefly mentioned last week, in which Jesus performs an unprecedented miracle in an unusual and a controversial way that puts the people involved in this at a crossroads, and they have to confront a false core belief in their lives. And in the same way, I think that Jesus' healing power today, and I'll give you the short answer, the answer is yes, Jesus does still heal today, puts us at a crossroads of what we believe and how we behave. And so let's jump right in to a really crazy, fascinating story in the book of John, chapter 9. In John 9, Jesus and his disciples are in the temple on the Sabbath day. And we pick up the story right in verse 1. It says that Jesus passed by and he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So his disciples ask a question that is weird on the surface. Like, what would make them assume these things? See, we're given an insight into a false core belief that they held. In the time of Jesus, that they had a core belief that if you were ill, if something bad happened to you in your life, that it was directly responsible, or there was a sin in your life that was responsible for that. And so the disciples in the temple on the Sabbath day observed this blind man, and in their pious nature, they turn to Jesus, and they must think that they're quite astute theologians, and they say, Jesus, look at that blind man, tell us, did he do something bad? Or did his mom and dad do something bad? What a ridiculous question, right? It's basically a biblical version of karma, is what they're thinking. That every bad thing has a result to it. And Jesus addresses this verbally, but I don't think he really changes their mind with what he says as much as what he does next. Jesus says to them, guys, that's not why he's blind. He's not blind because he sinned or his mom and dad. Imagine growing up as a blind man in this society. Not only did you have to worry about the fact that you couldn't see, but also the fact that everybody thinks that your mom and dad were scoundrels, or that you were so evil from birth that God thought it would be best for you to be born blind. It must have been a challenging existence. And Jesus says, no, this has a different purpose. This particular sickness is to display the glory of God today. And he says something fascinating in verse 4. He says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. In other words, he's inviting his disciples into the activity that he's about to do. And I'm his disciple, and if you're a follower of Jesus, you're his disciple. So it's important for us to pay attention because we also we're participants in what Jesus is about to do in our lives. And I think that in some ways, there are still ways that we misread sickness in the world today. That we may not verbalize it like the disciples did, but maybe we also hold that belief. God allowed this sickness because I must be a wicked person. Otherwise, he wouldn't let this come to me. And that could be a straight lie from the devil. You could have all kinds of mistaken identity problems related to sickness. Well, things get really interesting in verses 6 and 7. So Jesus says this, but look what he does. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. This is like the favorite Bible story for all 5-year-old little boys. All right? And he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Oh, that's strange. What's he thinking? In one action, Jesus breaks a lot of religious rules in this time. All right? First of all, in many regards, they considered any bodily fluid, including spit, sometimes to be unclean, especially if you were an ill person. That made you unpresentable in the temple courts. Second of all, it's against the law to make mud pies on the Sabbath, okay? Legitimately there's a rule about that. And finally, you just don't heal people on the Sabbath day. And so I don't think that Jesus can make a stronger demonstration that he doesn't care about the ridiculous rules than what he does here. Spits on the ground, makes mud, puts the mud on the man's eyes, and then heals him through that. Jesus is basically making a statement that you guys have some really false core beliefs about religion, about sickness, and I'm about to do something that's going to completely rattle the way you see things. Now, Jesus never heals anybody again this way. He never makes any more mud pies and puts mud on people, all right? So it's not a common practice in the church today. We don't go anointing people with mud. And I think part of the beauty of that is that Jesus wants us to look to him for healing, not in any particular method, all right? He doesn't want us to go around thinking there's magic mud, all right? There's only the power of Jesus. We don't think that trinkets or people or water or oil have any special healing power in themselves. The only power that heals comes through Jesus Christ. Well, the man is healed. And what's fascinating is the response of his neighbors. And look at verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is not this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but it's like him. So they said to him, he kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, how then were your eyes opened? He answered, a man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. He didn't know where Jesus is. He was blind last time he encountered Jesus. Now he can see. He never saw what Jesus actually looked like. So here's these poor neighbors. They're confronted with a false core belief. All right? So they meet the blind man who's not blind anymore. It's easier for them to believe that he suddenly has a twin doppelganger walking around the temple, looks like the same guy, dresses like the same guy, in the same place, it's easier for them to believe that there's suddenly a new mysterious twin than for them to actually believe that he was healed. Like, that was a bigger, an easier leap for them to believe than to assume that Jesus had healed this man. I think, though, that we do the same thing, right? We hear sometimes stories of healing, and like the inward critic in us comes out, and they need to run those tests again. No, I don't really think so. Maybe they weren't really sick. They were just faking it, right? How many of us come up with all kinds of plausible excuses as to why someone probably wasn't really healed? It was probably that, I don't know, we come up with all kinds of reasons. So I think that before we criticize these guys too much, we need to understand that some of that is represented in our own hearts because we have the same core belief. Now, all of these Jewish people believed that God could heal. They believed the Old Testament, in which were recorded many acts of healing. But when faced with someone who was really healed, they're like, that's not for real. That can't be the case. And I think that still is true in our own lives and my own life as well. Well, this gets the attention of the Pharisees. I mean, you just don't go around making mud pies on the Sabbath without getting the religious leaders upset. And so in verses 13 to 17, they get involved. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been formerly blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. In that one phrase, he explains all the bad things Jesus did. It was the Sabbath day, he made mud, he opened the man's eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So, and this is an important verse, fascinating verse. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. All right. Religious leaders in Jesus' day do not consult beggars for their theological opinions. You just didn't do that. They were at the bottom of the social ladder. These are the religious elite. They know all the answers to God and the Bible, and yet they are so confused at what has just happened that they actually break protocol and they ask this beggar, this former beggar, what do you think about him? You're the one who is blind. Tell us what you believe. They're tormented by the fact that a divine activity has occurred, but it didn't occur within the narrow confines of their ideologies. They assumed that God only worked in a certain way. He only worked and he healed people within 6 days, and he probably didn't even do that anymore. That happened a long time ago. All right? And so now Jesus does a thing that doesn't fit within their mold, and it just rattles their cages so much. But I think we've got narrow confines as well, right? Some of us have been in situations where we think, you know what, God only heals us today, but he only does it through modern medicine. Other times we say, no, God only heals us through incredible flash moments, and we're just healed in an instant. And we've got these categories in which we think that God can work, and only in those categories can he work. But Jesus cannot be constrained this way. He can't be constrained. So, the Pharisees go, they're really messed up by this. They don't know what to do. So, they go and they find the blind man's parents. Maybe it's a big hoax. This has been the longest con in the history of mankind. His parents have been pretending that he's been blind from birth so they could have just a beggar and make a little extra income. So, what do we read here in verse 18? The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son whom you say was born blind? How obnoxious is that? You say he was blind. How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. His parents realize they're in a really awkward situation here, and they just don't want to get messed up in it. So they're just go ask our son. He's the one that was blind anyway. Go talk to him, see what he says. And if you read the next verse, you find out that the reason was the Pharisees had made a rule saying if anybody supports Jesus Christ, we're going to kick you out of the synagogue. No, it's no big deal to get kicked out of church today. Some of you have probably gotten kicked out of a church, right? I hope not, but maybe you have. In Jesus' day, if you got kicked out of church, that's bad. Like, it was your social network. It was your link to employment. You could get kicked out of your home if you got kicked out of the synagogue. You were forced to live as outsiders, as Gentiles, as unbelievers. They assumed you wouldn't be welcomed into heaven when you died. And so his parents are afraid. They're like, well, we don't want that to happen to us, right? Already the son is in an interesting spot because now he can't beg anymore. That's the only thing he knows how to do is beg. He's got to learn a trade. He's got to learn some new skill. And so they just kind of say, we don't know, but go ask our son. So the Pharisees go back to the blind man a second time. Maybe he changed his story. Maybe he's not blind. Maybe he's blind again. It was just a temporary thing. Who knows? But verses 24 to 34. So for a second time, they called the man who had been born blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." Speaking of Jesus. He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples?" He starts getting mouthy here. It gets really, really funny. I think at this point, the blind man knows he's kicked out of church. Like, there's just no turning back. He just lays all his cards on the table and just gives the Pharisees a really hard time. Obviously, they don't want to become a disciple of Jesus. But he says, "Do you want to become his disciples?" Also, meaning that perhaps the blind man has decided that he wants to become a disciple. Verse 28, they reviled him, saying, "Well, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." Listen to this guy. The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. He got kicked out of church. And in their last statement, they go back to that same false core belief that the disciples had. They say, "Listen, buddy, you were so sinful, your heart was so dark before you were even born that God made you blind. Shame on you. You're kicked out of church forever." All right. This guy, I want to, like some people when you get to heaven, there's people you want to meet. I want to meet the blind guy. All right. He sounds funny. He, even though he's been a beggar, which is a pretty low job on the social ladder, he has acquired a pretty robust theological view. And he argues with the Pharisees in such an articulate way that they can't even deny him. And this was his argument. He says, "Listen, we know that God doesn't listen to sinners. However, we know God does listen to people who do his will. Nobody has ever healed a man who was born blind. So if Jesus was not from God, God wouldn't heal him or hear him. But I am healed, I can see now, so therefore Jesus must be from God." You just can't argue with that logic. And they know this, and they kick him out of church. So now the man, what a wild day this guy has had. He starts the day blind and begging. He's got his own little niche in the Jewish social system of the day. And at the end of the day, he can see, but he is kicked out of society. He can't worship in the temple any longer, and he has no employment. I think that this guy becomes a follower of Jesus for no other reason than he has no other option at this point. In verse 35, Jesus, and I don't know if we ever find Jesus hunting somebody out again, but in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered him, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things. They're eavesdropping on Jesus' private conversation. And they said to Jesus, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." All right. The fact that Jesus tracks down the man and finds him after hearing about getting kicked out of church demonstrates to me that his entire heart for this man is not necessarily that he see again, but for the man's soul. The miracle was an entry point for God to work in this man's life. If you look at the progression of the way that the blind man, who's not blind anymore, refers to Jesus, it goes like this. He says, "There was a man called Jesus." Then a moment later he says, "I think he's a prophet." And then he says, "I think I'm his disciple." And then he says, "I think he's from God." And then he says, "You're my Lord." And at the end, he bows down and worships Jesus. From just a guy named Jesus to the one that he's calling Lord and worshiping. Jesus indicates that his purpose is to give sight to the blind and to reveal spiritual blindness. Because healing, physical healing, is meant to draw us in worship to Jesus. In the end, any healing that we encounter, that God does in our lives, all right, any healing we encounter is really just temporary. Because in the end, we all die someday, right? If Jesus doesn't come back before then, we all will someday die and go to heaven if we are followers of Jesus. But spiritual healing, that is eternal. So, in conclusion, it is appropriate. It honors the Lord when we ask Jesus to heal us. In James, we read that when someone is sick, you should call the elders of the church to anoint and pray for him. It glorifies God. This is that way, when the healing occurs, we can celebrate all that God has done for us. We invite others to pray for us so that the testimony is widely received. In the end, it is God's decision to heal. In Jesus' day, there were many blind men and women, and Jesus did not heal all of the blind men and women, but he did heal this blind man. And he did it in a way that was undeniable and demonstrated the power of God. So, let us be a church that has a broad perspective of the ways in which Jesus can deal with our physical bodies. He may heal us through medicine. He may heal us in an instant. He may heal us over time. But let us demonstrate that belief by our actions. Just to close, I got to tell you this funny story that convicted me recently. I was, at the beginning of the college semester, I was playing ultimate frisbee with a bunch of college guys. And at this one practice, I dove through the air. It was a gorgeous dive. You should have seen it. I was laid full out. I caught the frisbee, and as I landed, that was the end of my glory. All right? The frisbee bounced out, and I realized that I'm a 34-year-old man playing frisbee with 19-year-old boys. I'm out of my league. And the next day, I woke up hurting really bad. My shoulder just hurt, and I didn't know what was wrong with it. Aching. I obviously did something wrong to it. Well, a few weeks later, our family goes to district conference, which is the pastor's convention for our district. And at one of the services, we're sitting there and they have a prayer and anointing service. So if you are sick, you're ill, you hurt, you've got a bad shoulder, you can ask them to come and pray for you. And so I'm sitting there with my kids. Now that we homeschool, I took the whole family. That's a great time, right? Let's go to a church conference, Dad. And so we're sitting there, and I'm thinking, I probably should explain this to my kids. And so I'm trying to say, all right, guys, the people out in the aisle, they're the people that they've got sickness, and they need Jesus to heal them. That's what they're doing. They're asking Jesus to make them better. And my son Isaac turns to me, and he says, "Dad, your shoulder and your knee," because I'm all sorts of broken, "they hurt. Why don't you go out there and have them pray for you?" Jesus only heals the big problem stuff. Let me go to the doctor first. Maybe if they can't fix it, then I'll ask Jesus. I didn't say those things, but I didn't go in the aisle. I was confronted with my inner core belief. I could have explained to Isaac very clearly, "Isaac, you know what? I could have explained how I believed in the healing power of God, but my actions did not demonstrate my heart in that moment." Well, actually, maybe my actions did demonstrate my heart and not my mind. What an amazing story it would have been if I could have stood up and told you that I was killing it in Ultimate Frisbee these days. You know what? I'm just on the pro circuit. No one's seen anybody like me. No, they haven't seen anybody like me, but not in a good way. Let's not be a church that just says what we believe, but let's be a church that actually prays for others. That we believe in the healing power of God, and we believe that He answers our prayers, and if it brings Him glory, He may just heal us, and we believe in that power. And let's be a church brave enough to do that. Let's live in community that way. Again, I am confident this is one of those messages that you have 1,000 questions rattling around in your mind, and I'm happy to try to answer some of those later. I'm more than happy to grab coffee or you can email me, but that's my big prayer for our church, is that we would be a church that lives out the theology that we believe in our minds as it relates to Jesus' healing power in the church today. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we believe that Jesus Christ came to set us free from sin and also to set us free from sickness. Someday that will look like eternal healing in heaven with you, where our bodies will be perfect and it will be wonderful. There are times, though, Lord, that you may be best glorified in healing our bodies even now, in this place, at this time, on earth, to bring you glory. And I don't want us to miss out on any opportunity for a good thing that you have for us because we're afraid or we misunderstand your word or any number of reasons. And so, Jesus, I pray that if anyone here today needs a healing touch from you, that they would ask for that you would be gracious and you would show your power in amazing ways in the commonplace. Jesus, we surrender ourselves to you in this matter. For it's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. I think it would be appropriate that if you do desire to have the elders and really pray for you, you're more than welcome to just kind of slip behind the bar over here during the praise songs, and I'll ask the elders to come on over. We'd be happy to